anyone can paint. This elitism with, oh, I couldn't do that because, I haven't been trained in it. It's not true. Like, you can, and I did. The dialogue between land and sky, the earth and us as people, the flowers that grow from the ground to the trees that you walk through, I'm a little bit woo-woo, and I do still think that they have their own personalities, which kind of just makes the whole process more fun. They definitely have their own things going on, and it's fun to think about that when I'm then painting. All I ever intend to do is to provoke joy. I think if there was any other intention, I'm not really sure what I'd be doing, because that's what makes me happy, painting English landscapes, all of it. I want to encapsulate that in my paintings and make sure that the viewer has that joy that everyone should feel when they are outdoors. Hi, my name is Rance and I'm a contemporary landscape painter. I'm here in the Jackson studio to talk a little bit about my practice. So I'm actually largely a self-taught painter. My first memories of making art are probably literally as a small child. Like, I was always the kid that wanted to draw at the table with print paper and pencils, or if we were out for tea, I'd have a napkin and a biro. Like, I always loved drawing. I thought I couldn't pursue art as a career necessarily, but my friend was actually visiting unis at the time, so I went along with her and she was looking at textiles courses. So when we went to Loughborough and I saw how amazing their textiles course was and the facilities they had and the fact they did weaving, I thought, who doesn't want to learn how to weave? So the rest is history. That's then what I went on to do at university and really enjoyed it. In terms of painting style, I keep coming back to the word intuitive because sometimes I don't know how to explain why what happens on a canvas happens. It's just, I guess, the way that my brain has processed what I've seen, my personal preference in terms of colour and mark, and those two things sort of put together and creating a painting at the end of it. I feel like that's why my painting style feels quite fun, quite vibrant, colourful, textured. It's almost like stuff is coming from everywhere, and that then creates that result. My experience doing my degree at Loughborough was honestly 10 out of 10. We tried different pathways that we could then take on in our second, third kind of years, but I chose weaving. I thought, if I'm going to pay all this money to do a degree, I want to learn something that I couldn't learn sort of outside of that setting. It was very, very hands-on, and we'd just spend days sort of in the dye lab, picking out our colour palettes, then literally hours threading these looms up. Like, sometimes you might have an organza warp that would have 1,000 ends, and we'd all just be chatting and sort of setting our looms up and honestly having the best time. So when people look at my work, sometimes they'll compare them to embroideries or tapestries, which when they don't know about my previous work in textiles, it can be quite interesting and fun in some ways for me to see how those influences are now showing up when I might not even be aware of it. I mainly use acrylic paints. I also use acrylic gouache, and I also use flash paint as well. As long as it dries quickly, I like it. I have kind of this immediacy. The more you practice with the paint that you use, the more you can use it in ways that make the paintings look like your paintings. And I feel like I've really got a relationship now with acrylic paint and, sort of quickness to the process that doesn't mean the painting is finished quickly, but it means that each stage I can see it and I can move on. I love golden acrylics, both their heavy body and their fluid. I really love Holbein acrylic gouache. They come in some really lovely colours. you try out these new paints and try out different variations within kind of family of acrylic paint and all of the avenues that there are under that. It's what sticks, what you fancy using, what you like, the colours they come in, all of these things, they all kind of feed into then what you choose to use in your paintings. I think there's a lot to be said for finding your materials and what works for you. I think my relationship with colour stems from my personal preference and colours that I'm drawn to. A lot of my work features pastel tones and quite a range of them. Sometimes have these sort of muddier pastel tones with fresh pastels cut with these more acidic tones like chartreuse or like a sharp kind of turquoise. I think when you're using these kind of middle ground ranges, it needs to be lifted in some way. And so I'll go in with accents, pastel pinks, lilacs. I love a bright red, love a fluorescent pink, a great accent, or to be honest, base colour and underpainting colour. A little bit of fluorescent pink mixed in with like a potter's pink. That's kind of my secret recipe for a great muted but still bright pink. Like I love a chartreuse and kind of an olivey green, dark forest greens, a sap green, pinks and greens. Enough said. I love mixing colours, and I think mixing colours creates palettes that are very specific to you because, you know, everyone mixes colours differently and has their favourite shades. Sometimes I feel like I have like rose-tinted glasses on when I'm seeing stuff, which immediately gives you this sort of more vibrant colour palette and playfulness that might not be there right in front of you. You kind of have to use your imagination a little bit. But I think that that's the joy of painting a landscape, is that you can decide whether you want, you know, that river to be lilac or whether you want, you know, the sky to be a very specific shade of muted pink. Because if you're the one painting it, that's half the fun, is that you can make those decisions. So in my final year of uni, we had our degree show, and my collection was called Where the Mountain Meets the Sky, where I kind of first found my sort of significant interest in the British countryside and the landscapes we have here. I tried to create this sort of whimsical sense of where the mountain meets the sky, making these sort of personified mountain and sky, playing on this idea of them being British landscapes, but also British etiquette, our politeness, how do they talk to each other, that kind of thing. I found that really sort of fed into my work through my colour palettes, the pastel tones I was using. If I am travelling around the country or abroad, I'll definitely get inspiration, but I would happily paint the river that's by my house 1,000 times. It's always going to be different. The seasons are always changing. You're always going to see something new, like a different perspective. It's abundant. There's so much on our doorsteps that we don't even notice. And if you just look a little bit closer sometimes or see it in a different light, I think it's funny when people, you know, don't have this connection with nature and view us as part of it. When you really look at, you know, trees, for example, you look at their bark, they genuinely have eyes on them. Like, I look at a tree and look at their bark and tell me that you don't see that they have eyes. They mimic kind of our form in so many ways. Like, to be honest, we probably mimic their form. Like, that came first. So yeah, I think it's just such a natural extension to use my hands to relay what I've seen in our natural world. Going out walking, spending time in nature, it is very cliche, but it's so calming, it's so fulfilling. You're never gonna get home from a walk in the outdoors and feel worse for it. So I think in terms of that being the inspiration for my painting practice, yeah, it's kind of, it couldn't be anything else. Like, that is just what I feel drawn to do. Spring has it for me. I love spring. The hope you feel when new shoots are coming up and you can see the sort of world turning slightly, and that the crispness in the air, blue skies for the first time where it's like a little bit warm, the visual kind of change in spring, I feel like it's the most dramatic and in turn potentially the most inspirational for me as a painter. They do kind of emulate the colour palettes that I choose to use anyway. So it's kind of a match made in heaven. Like, me and spring, I just love spring. We were literally in the garden the other morning and our poppies from last year had come up and we could see that they were going to bloom, and one of them still had its little sort of, green head on, and it had split. We were waiting for this gorgeous poppy to come out, and lo and behold it did. And I just think, if we hadn't have taken that minute to just, take stock and see what was happening in the garden that morning, we wouldn't have seen it. And it's just a good little metaphor for slowing down in life and, really actually taking joy in small things. As much as everyone says that, I think really the core point of my painting practice and my life as an artist is these sort of small moments of joy that, really make the world go round. It's just really special to savour these moments, not let them pass us by, and have these kind of immortalised in visual art that you can then bring into your home and have that kind of outdoor joy in your interior spaces and in your homes, wherever it may be. I think the lack of figures and animals in my work is genuinely quite a practical result of the way that I work and what I choose to paint. I only really want to paint what I've actually seen and what I've kind of sat in or walked in, or I'll see swans and I love a good swan. Swans have shown up in my work, and the odd bird. I'm more focused on the naturescape and the trees and the grasses and the water and all of those things that I can see. But in terms of people, that's not what we're about. Like, I want to paint nature. I want to paint, luscious greens and water flowing and the earth. I just, sometimes I think that can speak enough for itself without adding further context. I approach a painting from back to front. What are the kind of back pieces and shapes? And it is very much like a jigsaw, because I kind of deconstruct the landscape in my mind before I start the painting so that I know what needs to come first. I'll always start with an underpainting of a wash, and usually that's quite a warm pink, or sometimes like a pale lilac-y blue. But then I'll build the painting with these bigger shapes. So I might put in these kind of bigger expanses of shapes for trees. I might map out kind of the land and get those rooted before then thinking, okay, what's coming next? Where does that foliage lie? Or where are kind of the lines of the trees going and the clouds? And with every new shape and every new layer, there's a slight gap between where each shape sits. So you can almost see how it's been built, because there's always an element of what came before it still on the painting. I'm seeing the tree for the shape that it is, and that's then the shape that I'll paint first off with a wash of colour. Then I'll see the foliage and I think, okay, that will be stippling. I'll then see where the branches lie, and that's where I then, again, take this artistic license to think, okay, what needs to be there for it to represent that it's a tree, but leaving out smaller details that you don't need to see to know that it's a tree. to let your brain almost fill in the gaps, which I think makes the paintings have that kind of naive sense, that naivety that I think links with the joy of it all, that it doesn't need to be super serious for it to still be a serious painting. There is a nice harmony between working outdoors and working in the studio. When I'm working outside, I never am too precious. I don't intend to sort of finish these masterpieces. It's very much, I guess, part of my process. I wouldn't go outdoors to start a painting, finish a painting, frame it, there you go, it's finished and I've worked on that outdoors. It's kind of like a muscle that I intend to flex as part of my process. Like it's a key part of, I guess, kind of keeping this magic and this connectivity to the landscape and what I'm working on. Like, you never want to become too disconnected from your subject. There wouldn't be that final painting if I hadn't have had these days outdoors, had those times out walking. When I'm going out to paint, I normally just take a rucksack for ease, sometimes a little tote bag, like to have extra stuff in, but I've got a little mat that I can it concertinas out that I can sit on if the ground's like a bit wet or something, and it's quite comfy as well. You want to be comfortable. I'll have a few sketchbooks because if I've painted in one, my nature is that I just want to do the next thing and I don't want to wait for it to dry, so I can work on kind of another piece or lay paint backgrounds down and do a few at a time so the colours sort of align. I'll take a few tubes of paint because you never know how much you're going to use, and sometimes I just hate the feeling of being restricted, and sometimes if I feel like I'm restricted in terms of, size of the paint I'm bringing or like a tiny palette, it can make my work feel restricted and feel a bit tighter. Working outdoors has a magic to it that can't be, replicated in an indoor setting like the studio. But obviously the studio is way more set up for kind of focused work when I'm working on bigger scale pieces, and it gives me more focus. I can spend more time really looking at these photos that I might have taken, seeing what I want to put in the painting, think about colour more. You're not having to be as reactive as you are when you're working outdoors. Obviously, the conditions stay the same. You're not going to get rained on, or wind's not going to come and, blow your paper everywhere. It's just more controlled, which has its benefits as well and is a great, focus time. And I will always have outdoor painting and drawing, in my priorities and how I want to spend my time, because there is this magic in it that you can't replicate when you're indoors. My sketchbook practice really revolves around what I'm drawing when I'm out on location and, sat drawing and painting outdoors. They become this kind of archive of your brain and your thoughts that you've had that might not have seemed sort of cohesive at the time, but when you look back on them sort of with a fresh view, you're like, oh, this links and that links, and oh, I drew like that there and I picked that up from that scene and that kind of thing. So yeah, they become this sort of bank of visual knowledge that informs future work. It's like a working document. It's not meant to be, this kind of glittery finished thing. It's just sort of you working through things, trying things out, random little drawings, snapshots of scenes, of details, that kind of thing. So I think that's the inner child in me, and liking sticking things down and, gathering things. I get like a little magpie or something. I don't know, but I think starting in sketchbooks and having them in my bag and taking them out when I was walking, it felt quite safe. Moving then those drawings and paintings that were in that kind of smaller space onto bigger canvases, it just felt quite freeing and kind of like, well, why can't I do that? After leaving Loughborough, I really thought I was going to go into textiles as a career, and was actually set to move up north and be a textiles technologist, which, looking back, I think I would have been really unhappy doing that, because I think it would have been too constrained. But it was the start of 2020, obviously quite a pause in the world, and that got halted and didn't come to fruition. But it was in that time and that year, over the next sort of 6 to 9 months, that I didn't create at all. Obviously, it was a sad time. It was really at the end of that year that I thought, no, I need to do something about it. Like, I don't want to lose this whole sort of creative part of me and my whole being, and not paint or draw anymore. So I picked up my sketchbooks and I got some new materials, and I just started going out walking and sort of drawing what I was seeing on location outdoors. And I thought, this is what I should be doing. Like, this is what makes me happy. This is what sort of gives me the purpose that I'd sort of lost in that year. And it was then a sort of couple of years later, after doing on the side of, you know, odd jobs and jobs that weren't creative, but sort of what I had to do, that I left then my job and have been painting full-time since. When it comes to using mediums with the paint I use, sometimes I will use a tiny bit of like acrylic flow medium, something like that, just if I'm covering a wider area, or in contrast to that, wanting to kind of make tiny brush strokes. It can just make the whole experience a lot more sort of glidey and frequent and easier to cover a big expanse with a small mark. So that's when I'd use something like that. But overall, I just tend to wash my acrylics down with water, because it's easy, it mixes in well, you can get different transparencies. That's kind of just what works best for me. Because I use acrylic and some more flat mediums like the acrylic gouache and the flash paint, you know, if you're to look at the painting from a certain angle, flat on, obviously that would be fine, but you just want, when the light hits it, to not see kind of matte sections and shinier sections. So I just seal it all in with, a satin varnish. So I do take a lot of photos when I'm out and about, especially if I haven't had time to actually sit down and draw whilst I'm out, which is most of the time really. I'll print it out onto a piece of paper, and that's then what I work from, and then I'll just paint it. Like, I'll grid it up. It's kind of my most organic way of, you know, limiting the amount of steps between seeing the landscape and then painting it when you don't have the time to paint it there and then. As long as it's something that I've seen and I've experienced and then I've taken the photo of, I can still relate to what I'm painting. Like, all of those tiny decisions in taking that one photo, I feel like then creates, you know, that authenticity in the painting, because I've stopped in that moment. I've seen that, I've seen this. Like, I love the way that looks and the light is there. And all these tiny details that no one's going to know about, but I'd know about them. And I almost paint my landscapes as if there isn't an edge to the canvas or the board or the panel that I'm working on. I've already made those decisions whilst out. So there's a natural ending to that crop of the landscape. And naturally that lends itself then to the edge of the canvas or the panel, the board, whatever it is I'm working on. I don't really have a preference. I like them equally. I think canvas can have that natural texture that lends itself quite nicely to landscape painting, because of obviously the organic texture that you see in nature anyway. I think it's quite a nice fit. The canvas can be it's obviously really absorbent, and if you don't have a lot of kind of fluidity to the paint you're using, it can drag sometimes. So working on the wooden panel, that smoothness is quite refreshing if I've been working on canvas for an extended amount of time. I tend to stick more to sort of squatter compositions, not these kind of sweeping, panoramic landscapes. Just because what I find interesting about a landscape are sometimes some of the smaller details. Like, I want to get closer in on a tree. I want there to be these blades of grass in the foreground. I love kind of a clearing in the landscape, and a lot of the time that shows up in my work. Feeling like you can be drawn in is something that I love, that feeling for the viewer to have, that they feel like they're almost in it and like they're surrounded by it. And having a little more space sort of vertically than horizontally allows that kind of upwards feeling, and feeling like you can almost step into what I've painted. You obviously want your paintings to evoke a feeling and be a feeling in some ways. So you're inviting whoever's looking at your painting sort of into your process, into how you've done something. And it kind of, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but it's kind of a togetherness, like between what I've done and then whoever then has that painting and then takes that on. It's obviously then theirs, and they have that kind of not piece of me, but they have that reason in their painting. A typical day for me in the studio, it can look different depending on what I'm doing. Like, if I am going to be going out drawing, then I usually do that in the morning, and then we'll head to the studio in the afternoon. But a lot of the time when I'm really into a body of work or a collection, or I've got deadlines and I've got, paintings that need to be done, I actually do sort of stick to quite a traditional kind of working day. I think because my partner works a normal job, it's good for me to have that structure and kind of accountability as well. And because the studio is out of my house, it means it kind of keeps me in sort of normal daily life in a way. And I'll normally just be painting all day, basically. Sometimes I forget to eat lunch because I'll just be cracking on, and you're kind of in that flow and you do sort of forget that you're at work. But I think it's the previous life in me of, showing up to my jobs and things that has kind of stuck, and I continue to do that, and it's how I feel most productive. Although when I go in on the weekend, I have a feeling in me that I don't have on the weekdays, because it makes it feel like it's still something like I'm just doing for fun, which I'm just painting, and like it doesn't really matter, and that can be really nice. So my studio space is at the front of a warehouse, which is great. I've got a lot of space. It's not the garden studio of my dreams that hopefully will come later in life, where I can hear birds singing and, wander down the garden path and, I'm going to go and paint. Like, it's not really that vibe right now, but I'm still very grateful for it. You do have light, you have natural light, but in the winter months, I do have to rely on artificial light, which has its challenges, but it kind of is what it is. I think, to have any space to paint is an ultimate privilege in my mind. So I'm always just grateful to be able to show up somewhere and not have to tidy everything away like I did for quite a few years when I was just working at home and, on my kitchen table and all of those kind of things. One thing that is sort of a non-negotiable when it comes to me painting is definitely like a spinny chair. I'm constantly kind of moving around and fidgeting and have one leg up, then sitting another way, then sitting another way. And so I'm kind of like whizzing around my studio on this spinny chair. And I can't even imagine if I had to sit still. Like, I don't think that would be possible for me. So yeah, thank you, spinny chair, because you do me an absolute solid. In terms of what I listen to when I'm painting, I do love a podcast. My taste is very varied, and I kind of, if something interests me, then I'll listen to it, whether it's kind of a popular culture, a nature one, or a gardening one. But I also am guilty of having a lot of reality TV on in the background, which I know does not align with, painting landscapes, and my taste should probably be a little bit more highbrow, but I love a reality TV program, and Yeah, I'm not ashamed to admit it. I use a lot of synthetic kind of tapered brushes just because they work well with the acrylic paint that I use, but natural bristle brushes are a huge part of my kind of secondary painting process after I've laid out kind of the flatter shapes of colour. I use those with quite minimal amounts of paint to stipple and, you know, create these kind of more bristly marks that are more reminiscent of nature and trees and all of that kind of thing. Like there's kind of this marrying of smooth and texture, which I think is probably then quite apparent in the final paintings because you've got these flat areas, but you've got these highly dense areas, and really it's the brushes that help me do that. I prefer a short-handled paintbrush just because I like the control it gives me. Sometimes it's nice to have a bit of freedom, but I think because my approach is quite free in a sense, when I'm adding those details towards the end of the process of the painting I'm working on, it's quite nice to feel a bit more considered with what I'm doing, and having kind of a denser, bristly brush can be nice to really be intentional with where the marks are going. I tend to lean more towards rounded brushes, sometimes slightly tapered. They're quite good for, you know, getting specific shapes and getting in close to the shapes and how they marry together and leaving that slight gap. And I would never be without a really, really tiny precision brush for those really small grass marks that I feel like you couldn't replicate with another kind of tool. Like, I don't think you could have one without the other, and I don't think the paintings would make sense if there wasn't both of those marks sat next to each other. When a work goes wrong, which I think sometimes it's important to reframe that and think, okay, this is going wrong, but it's also just a process. A lot of the time, a good painting has had a very ugly stage, and that is really normal, and it happens to the best of us. It happens very frequently. I'd say most of my paintings do end up in the corner at some point in my studio where I can't actually even look at them because I think they're that ugly. And that's okay, because if you wait a few days and you go back to them, you see them in a way that you didn't when they were in that ugly stage and you were thinking that. I think it's important just to take a step back and give it a little bit of time, because you'd be in fear of completely overworking it if you're trying to really push through, especially if you're feeling frustrated with how it's going. Work on something new, start something different, and then a lot of the time, by starting something different or working on a different piece, just giving it a bit of breathing space, you can just see it in a completely different light and move forward, because there's nothing that a good night's sleep can't fix with an ugly painting. For me, I know a painting is finished just before I think it's finished. It is that kind of sweet spot of those slight tweaks that you can make can completely change the composition or feeling of the painting, especially with landscape work as well. Just feel that bit too done. When you have that breathing room, whether that's, you know, a pathway in the land, a body of water, an area of sky that's not covered in trees, I think it just needs that tiny little kind of passageway of stillness. And if you have that, and you have kind of the rest of the composition then sorted with kind of the busier areas, the pattern, the texture, that's when I know that it's done and I'm happy with it. I'll always come back again the next day, a couple of days later, and there might be something that I might slightly just want to change, or a slight colour balance, or the tiniest tweak. But in general, it is that just before moment where you think, okay, no, we're done, I can leave this. I, of course, love going to exhibitions. I have my favourite specific painters. I love Milton Avery. I love Fairfield Porter. Of course, David Hockney. I love Vanessa Bell. I don't think you can argue with David Hockney's spirit and joy for landscape. I love seeing old footage of him painting outside and the kind of sheer joy and elatedness that he has for our natural world and painting our natural world is unmatched, and it's infectious, and it's something that really stays with me. I always come back to his connection to the land, the way that he translates it in his paintings. He's just the ultimate inspiration. There's so many artists and people throughout history that I have got influence from, but in terms of my knowledge of art history, I definitely am not clued up. It's something I'd love to learn more about and have sort of more off-the-cuff knowledge of where these particular artists sit in sort of the landscape of art history. Of course, learning is really important and something that I have interest in and strive to know more about. But just if you're wanting to paint and you love paintings and you love art and you love soaking all of this culture up, that's okay too. Like, we don't have to get too bogged down in knowing sort of every which part of art history. I think when it comes to painting, and to be honest, anything that you're going to do in life, if you do it with integrity and with the intention of joy and you only want it to have a positive outcome, I think you're pretty set. Like, if you're doing something that makes you happy and brings you joy, keep doing it, because by you doing that, without you even realising it, you're putting good energy and you're radiating those vibes that everyone needs more of anyway into the world, and it all bounces back. It's all cyclical, and it all, what goes around comes around, but that links to positive things too. So whether it's painting or whether it's playing football, can't relate, but anything, just keep doing it if it makes you happy and brings you joy.